This is A Silent War Within, the podcast dedicated to confronting the unseen mental health battles carried by our first responder and healthcare heroes. This show is about real stories, real struggles, and real ways to survive the storm and come out stronger on the other side. For too long, stigma has kept you silent, but this is your space to bravely break that silence, share vital insights, and build a community where your well-being truly comes first. Because your service deserves unwavering support.
Welcome, everybody, to A Silent War Within. We're happy to have you here with us again. And this week's show is really special to me. I told Kevin, who is our guest today, that I was kind of in fangirl mode because I've read all of his books. We have an award-winning author with us and the author to three of my favorite books, Kevin Hazzard. Kevin, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin. Good to be here.
Yeah, and I love you. I got to make the joke. I love your first name. Beautiful first name. So tell us about you. Tell us about where your EMS journey started and kind of where you came from.
You know, I think I got into it like a lot of people get into it, which is sort of a bit by accident, a bit backwards. It's like one of those things. I mean, I think there are kids who grew up like, I'm going to be a firefighter or whatever. But I think for a lot of us, something happens, something clicks along the way and this door opens. And, on the other side of the door is an ambulance. And that definitely is how it was for me. I was working as a reporter and covered a story about a tunnel collapse, and that high angle rescue team who brought, ultimately, like the guys who were working in the tunnel, they were dead. But the guys who brought them out, the high angle rescue team, there was just something about them, just like watching them, looking at the way they carried themselves. It was, I mean, you know how it is. You see people that have been doing the job for a while, and there's a certain confidence that they have that suggests something about them. And I was young, and I was looking for something, and that moment sort of opened it up for me. So that was what brought me in.
Yeah, yeah. And you worked at Grady, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, Grady is one of the busier EMS systems in the United States. Did a little research, and last year they run well over 140,000 calls. And that's just mind-boggling to me. How'd you settle in such a busy area? Was that close to home, or did you kind of always have the "I want to work for Grady" thought?
I mean, if you live in the Southeast, there's just certain things like if you want to be, in trauma, like people say, like, they say Grady, they say Erlanger. Like there's certain places that sort of ring out for hospitals and stuff. And then for EMS services, it's the same thing. I lived in Atlanta, but, people knew Grady. Grady is just sort of, it's an entity. Yes, it's how the city of Atlanta gets its 911, but it's also this massive public hospital, is the Southeast's largest trauma center. It's a massive burn center. It had the world's only 24-hour sickle cell clinic. I mean, it's just this huge, it's an ecosystem, and the whole city sort of gravitates around it for better or worse. And knowing how crazy Grady was and how busy they were. And I'd read the book. I actually enjoyed the book because I found the movie kind of like depressing, but I'd read Bringing Out the Dead, and Grady had that same vibe as that book. People I talked to who worked at Grady, and just seeing their ambulances are like beat up, and they're in the worst neighborhoods and the craziest places. It's just one of those things where I was like, yeah, that's where I want to be.
That's awesome. It sounds like, and I was really enthralled by your book, A Thousand Naked Strangers. It was one of my favorites at the time, since only cataclysmed by American Sirens. And I think that's just because the story is so rich there.
Mm.
But in A Thousand Naked Strangers, you talked about your like intro to EMS and how that was kind of a touristy phase. Everything was new and cool, and
Yeah.
all those trigger words that we use when we talk about our first experiences in EMS, and it's all this rush. And it was kind of a spectacle to you. You even said that in the book, that this was all a spectacle. So looking back, did that tourist mindset keep the internal vibration of the job at arm's length before it became real? Or do you think it was real the moment you walked into it?
The job itself, that's a good question. I think the people were real and the experiences were real. Being a brand new EMT, as anyone who has done the job will tell you, by necessity, it's kind of like a voyeur's job because it's really a paramedic's gig. I'm not saying EMTs don't save paramedics. I'm not saying if you're as experienced a paramedic as has ever existed, you don't want a good EMT next to you, because all those things are true. Like, a great partner is a great partner, regardless of his or her certification level, period. But there are certain realities. And the medic is the one who's like, he's filling out the paperwork, talking to the doctors, and doing the work on these critical calls. And so when lives are on the line, especially when you're new, because like you don't have the ability, like, not only is it not technically something you're supposed to be doing, but those just aren't your skills yet. So it was a mixture of, somebody else being in charge and also, entering into it, which I don't think I'm unique here, entering into it because I wanted adventure. And so it all feeling like an adventure. But those people, you start having conversations with these people, and, the sort of great magic trick of EMS is that you really, like, you think you're there for the sirens, but turns out you're there for the people. You run the same person 2, 3, 4 times. Maybe you run them the last 2 or 3 times that anybody runs them. The last time they leave their house, it's with you. And that begins to chip through that and sort of call bullshit on that mindset. And I think that was definitely how it worked for me. It was sort of a mixture of, I talked about it in the book. I made a comment to somebody in the hospital, about like, hey man, you're the professional here. And he just sort of looked at me like, he wasn't being a jerk. He was being real. And he was like, well, then what's that make you? And it was a combination of like that reality check with just the slow drumbeat of real people, real lives, and how much they trust you and how much they need you. It just pulls you out of whatever fantasy you had about what life on an ambulance will actually be like.
So at what point did you sit down and go, man, I have to write all this stuff down? When did you say, I'm going to write 1,000 Naked Strangers?
I mean, there's 2 answers to that. I started a blog while I was still working. And the reason I did that was because people are always asking, as I'm sure they do, like, your friends are like, Kevin, we just met this dude. You got to tell him, this is my friend Steve. You got to tell him a story about that guy who had, so you tell those stories over and over again. And one, you get tired of telling those stories, but over time, like, the details begin to fade. The edges get worn down. And at one point, like threw in a detail to one of my stories that I had forgotten. So it was kind of like, oh, I'm losing these. Let me just write them down. So I started that for those 2 reasons. But that was all I intended to do, was just entertain people, friends particularly. And then after I was gone and had been gone, I knew that there was probably like a larger audience for whatever it was sort of rolling around in my head. Because I knew I couldn't be the only one who had experienced this and had gone through these things and had these thoughts. And then also, like, and it sounds like eggy and weird, but I think like people understand it. I did kind of need to make sense of what it all meant to me. This was like, yes, you change and you grow and you this and that, and you experience things that sort of give you a different perspective, but like, what's the whole picture? And I just wanted to spend some time thinking about that idea of like, what was this journey and who am I at the end of it? Like, now that I've gone through this thing, what did it all mean? And that was really, where I began. I mean, the book was so much longer in its initial draft because I was just like everything that, like, all of my partners and all of my experiences. And the editor was like, dude, we got to find the spine of this thing. Cause it was like 480 pages.
Wow.
And we narrowed it down to that journey of like the beginning to end, which is of course what I had set out to do, but I needed somebody to help me kind of winnow it down.
That is just awesome. And it's one of my favorite books so far. And one of the things that I love the most about it, and I guess probably because I went through a little bit of this too, when I initially got my paramedic, there was a part in the book where you were kind of like, the system, I kind of know more than everybody else. You kind of got a little bit of paragod syndrome. And I don't think it was that you were saying that you know more than everybody else, but you knew you could trust yourself and your partner and you were going to do exactly what you had to do and get it done because you do when you come out of paramedic school, and even 2 or 3 years into your career, you get this, I'm really good at this. I trust myself. So talk about a little bit about how that kind of bridged in. And there was a moment there where you realized you weren't quite as big of a paragon as you thought you were. And just tell that brief little story there, because I really enjoyed that part of the book.
And I think we all have that, and it's not just like I didn't come out of school thinking I know everything and I'm going to get it. Like I definitely knew people who the minute they got their numbers, they hit the streets and you couldn't tell them anything. It was more, you work for a couple of years, you really get your legs underneath you, and it's that idea of like there's nothing more dangerous, than someone with just a little bit of knowledge. And when you have just enough knowledge to be really comfortable with what you're doing and to know most of what you're doing, but that's the point at which you don't realize how much you don't know. And those are the things that come with experience. And so you have a partner that you get along with, and you're doing this job. If you're doing it right, nobody messes with you. Like supervision is happy to leave you alone if you clock in and clock out and you run your calls and you don't get complaints. You know what I mean? Like they just leave you alone. And so you go for a couple of years with really no supervision, and things don't necessarily go wrong. And so I certainly began to think like, hell yeah, man, we got this thing on a string. Like the two of us, we have this. And then there was a number of things. I'd be curious about what, like specifically what stood out in the book, but for you, like what was the thing that you read that you were like, wow.
So there was one particular part, and I hope I get this right, but there was one particular part of the book where you guys just kind of figured out that, hey, we're going to do this ourselves. I think there was a mistrust there with maybe law enforcement. And you guys go on a scene and you realized really quickly, like, oh, we need help.
Yeah. Yeah.
'Cause that's exactly what happened to me. I kind of pissed everybody around me off because I was this, I kind of turned into this paramedic, especially I think it was my second year, where I would go on a scene and I would literally have told police officers, like, hey, I'm here now. This is my scene. Back up. That kind of mentality. And then once you get there, you're like, oh, gosh, we kind of need help. And there was one particular scene where
Yep.
had done that, had kind of set myself in that position and get there. And I'm a bigger guy. I've always stayed around the 300 mark. And this guy comes out of the house on PCP and picks me up over his head and throws me in the yard. And that's when I realized I had made a mistake. Like, I'm in trouble. And we actually had to physically fight with this guy. And I think that's what I related to so well in the story, is that you kind of got into a very similar situation where you're like, oh, I do need people.
Yeah. Well, and this is not like, I'm not one of those people that I've had my frustrations with the fire department as like, if you work for non-transporting, or if you're the transporting agency and there's a non-transporting fire department that works with you, just like the cops, there is affection among all those groups, but there's also friction among all those groups. And, I had certainly worked with firefighters that were just great medics and were really helpful. And I loved them, or were just like great problem solvers. They were just good at their job. But, you work with the other side of it too, guys who, the 23-year-old who's having a panic attack and you walk through the door and they're loading her up on her albuterol, and you got to like, there's only so many times you can pull a nebulizer off somebody's face and, disconnect their Decadron drip and, begin like trying to undo the asthma treatment that they didn't need and begin treating the panic that they do need before you stop doing it in a political way, like before you just kind of get rude about it. And so those sort of things contribute to it, I think, of like having that kind of experience. And I think sometimes that's why I think a lot of like really experienced ER nurses can be short with medics, because they see so many patients and they're standing next to doctors and they hear so much. And let's be honest, they do know a lot. And so I think some of the friction between nurses and medics is them being like, okay, because we certainly make mistakes. I mean, I've definitely rolled into the ER with a patient on a non-rebreather and seen the doctors immediately flick it off and be like, what does the matter with you? But so all those things kind of coalesce into Like, because you got to be a little bit cocky to do this job, because it takes a lot of confidence to make the decision. Like they say, we don't diagnose. That's a load of bullshit. We all know it. Like, if I am pushing 5 or 6 different drugs on you and going that far down the pathway, I've made a diagnosis. We can call it what we want, but at some point, let's be honest. Let's at least be, intellectually honest with one another and acknowledge what it is that medics are doing. And so, you got to be confident to make those decisions and to take control of a scene. So between the confidence and then just kind of learning that, like, I don't always need other people on the scene. I can do this. You guys could go ahead and cancel. It puts you in those situations where you just start thinking, we got this, we can handle this. And the thing you're referring to is they've shut them all down now, which is weird. Atlanta's got a different vibe, but they used to have these massive housing projects, and the largest of them all by far was called Bowen Homes, and it was deep in Northwest Atlanta. And we got out there, and it was for a domestic assault situation. You never know with those. Like, it could be a scratched finger. It could be somebody, beaten unconscious. And we got there, and it was somebody beaten unconscious. It was a woman. And I guess it was not the first time. Like, she'd had trouble with this guy. Her neighbors all knew that this was a situation. They liked her. He was an outsider, which automatically just created a dynamic. And so there was just a lot of tension. There was a lot of anger. There was just a lot of, and I think we've all been there. There was so much nervous energy and so much panic in the air. Like, it's like when that much emotion gets into a crowd, like, weird things begin to happen. And, at some point, a lake becomes an ocean if there's enough water in it. And, that's sort of how that crowd was beginning to behave. Like, you could just feel the volatility. We ignored it. We went inside, found this woman who, of course, was critical. I mean, she's unconscious. She's been beaten. She's posturing. You know what I mean? Like, you're thinking, like, we got to move. And so we're grabbing her. We're trying to get her out. And, it's stairs, it's stair chairs, it's jump bag over your shoulder, and an O2 bottle. It's like clanking up against everything, and like all the things, a cat that's in the way, and like somebody's friend who's there, like talking too much. And you're already thinking, like, what time of day is it? What kind of traffic are we going to hit? How am I going to get out? Where do we leave the stretcher? The patient's kind of slipping through your arms a little bit. You're sweating, your shirt's untucked. And we get outside, and all those people that had been sort of milling about were pressed up against the door. And the door opens up, and it was like one of those movies where there's like the courtroom scene, kind of like where all the press is gathered around. It was like that. And just the sight of her in her condition, I mean, like, fury is not a strong enough word. And all these people, I mean, I'm going to exaggerate, but God, if it had to be 30 or 40, like, it was a big, like, I couldn't see through them.
Mm-hmm.
It was a big, big crowd. And they just began pressing in, and you could feel the anger, and then like the looks on their faces, and like the hurt and the anger, and like, it all turned into rage, and all that rage was just aimed at us. And I began to think, like, dude, these people are going to pull our arms off. Like, this is not going to end well. And my partner, I didn't realize, had already punched the panic button on the radio, because he was the first one through. And I think somebody had a hold of his shirt. Like, they were already grabbing a hold of us. And there just happened to be 2 Fulton County marshals that were over there. They were serving, I guess, when marshals serve warrants and eviction notices and stuff like that. So they were doing something like that. They heard the distress call. All of a sudden, this like Fulton County marshal's car comes roaring over the hill and stomps on the brakes and, skids in the grass, and they hop out. And it was just enough of like, like a defibrillation to the heart of this crowd that sort of like stopped it, and everybody kind of like reset. And it was just enough for us to be able to get out. And I mean, I've never felt such love for another service as I did in that moment, staring at those 2 guys who hopped out of that car and, saved us from being beaten all to hell. Yeah. But yeah, that was sort of like, oh, that's right. Like, we are part of a larger unit. It is not just the 2 of us out here. You need people, you need help, you need, and at some point, other people have needed me. It didn't, like, I never thought they weren't good because some other crew called for help. Like, it's a natural thing. So what makes you think you're better than that? And it was, again, it's like, it doesn't take a lot to get you back on the right path, but sometimes it takes something.
But I also love the way, even telling that story, you can hear it in your book, especially if you listen to the audio version. And you could it just flies off the pages at you, that you were and likely still are pretty passionate about EMS. Like you enjoyed it while you were there. But I think there's also a turning point in that book where you realize like this identity is overtaking my life. So do you
Yeah,
feel
sure.
like that you had that? And then how'd you get away from it? What'd you finally do to break that cycle that we so typically get into for years I was Kevin the paramedic. That's the only way I knew myself was I was
Mhm.
so attached to that hat that I wore.
I definitely had that moment, or I sort of came to that, realization at some point, like, wow, this is kind of how I identify myself. You know how it is. Like it, on the one hand, it can be a huge frustration, but on the other hand, like that's where you get your sense of self worth. That is how you evaluate yourself. And there's something to be said for walking into a room full of people, in Atlanta, for instance, and being able to say, yeah, I'm a Grady medic, like that carries a certain amount of cachet. To say that you're a paramedic, people have a certain view of you. And interestingly, it's not like the heroic view that, the sort of the people who have never met a provider has, but it's like that motherfucker's competent. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there's a trust that people have in you. And it's not like a cool thing. But it's like, there's just a, like that guy, like if I, like, and your friends will kind of joke, like, if all hell breaks loose, you got to be there, like there's an understanding of what you are, of the sort of metal that you have. And it's a really cool, like, it's not like it goes to your, I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. Cause it's not like a cocky thing. It's a pride thing, you know, like somebody saying like, you're a really good parent. Like I take a lot of pride in that. And it's like that. It's not arrogance. It's just pride in what your job has sort of helped to turn you into. Yeah. I also was, my 30s were advancing. We had two kids, one of which, when he was young was really sick often. So I had to go from full time to part time just because he was always in and out of, he'd been in the ICU for a while. Like it was a respiratory situation. It's like every time a bug came through the room, like
Sure.
bang. My wife didn't have that kind of flexibility and I did. I took that role on, and then, she gets this job offer for us to move across the country, which is going to mean me quitting what I'm doing. It was like, okay, so is that all right? So and then you move and we move across the country. And now it's like, now I meet all new people who have no idea that guy existed and I'm not that person to them. And now I have to wrestle with like, well, then who am I without that? And that's where we get to, the moment where I thought I probably should write this down to figure this out,
Yeah.
because that was the pressing question. It was like, if nobody knows you as a thing that has defined you for 10 years, then what exactly are you?
And I think that the title of the book and in choosing the title, I don't know if it was thought through or if it was just funny that came out of the air, but there is a certain truth to it to where we do see potentially thousands of people in their worst day. Do you feel like that started to weigh on you seeing suffering like that over and over after a certain point in time in your career?
It's a good question. I've thought about that a lot. People ask that question a lot, and I think with an outside, if I'm talking to somebody else, I usually say, I kind of say no, but like with people who've been there, I try to be a little bit more honest and think about it. I don't know. I think it's like, it's a double-edged sword. Once you get trained and you put on that uniform, like that's what you want. You want your days to be filled with those sorts of things. You want to run those calls. You don't want to just get the headaches or the car wrecks or nobody's injured. You want all those bad things. And there's a tremendous amount of pride that you get from dealing with them well. A bad respiratory call that you handled well, a CHFer that you successfully navigated without like accidentally lying
Yeah.
down and
Yeah.
drowning,
Yeah.
or the trauma that you had the 48-second scene time, like those things. You're like, hell yeah, man. We're like, send it. Uh,
Hmm.
And there's also a bit of you that's like, look, I didn't give this guy asthma or an allergic reaction. I'm not the one who shot him. I did not get this woman pregnant. So I don't feel guilt for their condition. I feel empathy, but I don't feel guilt. But yeah, I mean, spending so much time in like crappy areas, And it's less like the really sick people than I think all the stuff that comes with it. The family, which is like, can be really angry and kind of bang on you. Just some of like the areas you walk into, like seeing like over and over again, on a Tuesday evening, like seeing kids awake, third grade kids awake at like 10:30 at night. And you're just like, damn, don't you have school or something in the morning? Like, where are you still awake? What kind of environment?
Yeah.
All of those things. And then you begin to, so you see somebody and you're like, I remember I was at a restaurant with my wife and I was like, I bet you I can tell you what that couple's apartment smells like. You know what I mean? Because you've been in so many places, you begin to.
You're exactly right.
Yeah, and it's just, and so, yeah, I think so. I think all those things kind of, not in like like the movies always want to portray it as like, I'm just so burned out, man, it's not, I don't think any of us ever really, I mean, we get burned out, but I don't think it's that so much as it's just like a general weighing down of all these different factors. And by the way, like, let's be frank, man, a lot of like the biggest factors are what they pay people in EMS, how they treat people in EMS, what our opportunities for advancement are in EMS. There was a brief moment in time, Grady has this neonatal transport unit. It's this giant MICU, and they take kids, all over the place, and they bring them to, there's now three big children's hospitals in the area, and they take them there. And there was a moment where those NICU nurses came under the umbrella of EMS. And the guy who ran our EMS department began trying to treat these NICU nurses the way they treated us. And dude, that lasted that fast. Those nurses were on the phone with their supervisor saying, nope. And their supervisor called him and was like, you don't talk to them. You don't say anything to them. They don't follow your rules. You don't even look at them. And he did. He was like, okay, nothing I can do about that. But he, like, all the things that they were immediately able to say, nope, we're not dealing with, he continued to impose on the medics on that NICU team. Like, there is a perception among certain leadership that like we're disposable and that it doesn't matter and you can just sort of treat us how you want. And that to me is like, I think that's one of the biggest things that like those factors are big in terms of like weighing down providers.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that I kind of giggle at is EMS is so full of inherent moral injury, and not just from our perspective taking care of patients, but there's a lot of management, and I'm in management now, so it's different for me to say this, but from management, we cause moral injury so often to our associates or employees because we just don't manage correctly, or we're giving bad answers about the pay, or we're treating one set of people different than the other. So I think that EMS has kind of a natural moral injury that occurs in that management relationship from staff. But did you feel a sense of moral injury when you actually departed EMS? When you said, what year did you stop doing the truck?
13.
13. That was a long time ago, Kevin.
Hey, no.
I mean, did you feel like you had walked away from something that you had worked your whole life for? Was it that type of injury to yourself as a person to not know kind of where to turn, or did you have a plan going out of it?
I did not have a plan. I did not think I would ever leave. There are people, I think every service has them, 58-year-old dude who works one shift a month, whatever it is he needs to keep his numbers and maintain his PRN status. I always loved those guys, It's like, damn, look at you, man, out here like doing your thing. And I liked it enough and I got enough out of it that I thought, why would I leave? I might not always be in it, but why would I leave? And then, to walk away, I mean, it was a surprise. It definitely felt like a severing. And I wasn't sure what was going to come next. I mean, there was also to a certain amount, to a certain degree of relief. We were moving. So we were going to get this new start. It had been exhausting because we had two really, really, our kids were born back to back. So it was this, like, all right, we're going to move to a new place and we're going to sort of begin again. Anybody who's got kids can tell you, like, there's some, hopping that you have to do with like young kids, man. I mean, it's a lot. juggling the childcare and all like it was really good to say, okay, like for a second, we're going to take a breath and kind of figure some things out. But there's no way to minimize or deny the fact that it's tough to walk away. It's tough to walk away.
So in that departure, did you ever truly learn how to turn it off or not feel that constant vibration of that EMS brings, that constant need for motion? Did you ever figure out how to turn that off? Because I struggle
No,
with that now. I
no.
still have what we consider the itch every once in a while. I'm like, man, I miss a good, mass casualty incident, or I miss a huge wreck on the interstate, or I miss my little old lady that says, I don't feel right. And then it's a game of guess to figure out what's wrong. And you go through all the diagnostic steps. And sometimes I miss that. So I just was
Mhm.
curious if you, somebody who's had so much experience and also written books and done the research, did it ever turn off?
I mean, I'm restless by nature. And I think most of us who get into
Mm-hmm.
this are restless by nature. I think people who stick around, I've said 1,000 times, like, I think if you come to this, that there is, and you stick around, if you're one of those people, there's so many people who come and they're immediately like, nope. But if you stick around, like, there is a hole in you that EMS fills. And I think it's like, yes, it's the excitement and all that stuff, but there's also like this family, this surrogate family that is born out of this thing. I mean, you can have not seen one of your partners, even a short-term partner. All we needed to have to do is run one memorable call together. 15 years later, I will see you and you and I will have that electric connection. And we both know it. Like, nobody else in the room has any idea what that look between us means, but that look between us is like, damn, you remember that guy? And, like, and then there's this hug and there's a real connection between those people. And so I think that kind of thing doesn't go away. That is just something that's built into your DNA or created by your life experience, this want that you have for some kind of the surrogate family, or even if you didn't know you wanted it until you found it. And the need for movement and all that. Yeah. I mean, I'm just, again, by nature, I'm restless. So it's difficult totally to walk away from anything that sort of fed that. But, you also know, like, those aren't every call. So
Mm-hmm.
much of it, is the other stuff. And I don't miss the other stuff.
No, me either. I think it's funny that so many of us are wired that way because we hear that so often on the show. I think you'll be episode 39 or 40. So we've talked to 40 different, either large content creators, authors, policemen that were in critical incidents. But what I find in that is that most of us that are in public service have that kind of internal rumbling that we can't be still. We can't. And some people say it's ADHD. Some people say it's a plethora of other things. But in reality, I think it's just that we want to be busy. We want to have something to do. So I think it's really cool to hear somebody who is as accomplished as you and have worked in these large medical systems like Grady say that that's a normal occurrence for you. One thing that I was pretty ashamed about when I found your next book, American Sirens, which by far my favorite writing to date from
Mm.
you or from any author, to be honest with you. What I was pretty ashamed about is I had never heard of Freedom House. I didn't know what that was. So tell us how you stumbled across this story, or was this something that was taught to you in school somewhere?
No, I think like most people, my first initiation to the history of EMS came the first night of EMT school. You hear about like Napoleon and the flying carriages. You hear that in World War I, we got some radios. In World War II, the sort of battlefield medicine began to leach back into the United States. And then it's 1965 and there's the white paper. And then here comes Johnny and Roy, like popping
Mm-hmm.
caps
Mm-hmm.
and slamming meds and cruising around Los Angeles. And now here we are. And so that's what I just assumed, like some version of that was like, okay, so that's all there is. And then it was the summer of 2018 and I got an email. I get, occasionally someone to reach out and be like, hey man, read your book, like enjoyed it, which is like, I can't tell you how wonderful it is to have someone say like, I work in, Dubuque and for a service that runs 11 calls a month. But I read your book and I connected with it. Like that there is this universal experience that is EMS is really great. And to have been able to tap into that gets, I'm very honored. But, I wish I had the email, but the gist of it was, read your book, enjoyed the story. Have you heard this story? He just asked, have you ever heard of Freedom House? And like those two words don't quite fit together even, I
Right.
was like, Freedom House. Like, I don't even know. I have no idea what that means. So I looked it up, and the whole time I'm going through this and I'm like looking at, I'm sort of scrolling through this browser. I'm thinking to myself, at any moment I'm going to come across the definitive accounting of this story, like the long start to finish, all the players, here's what happened, because you get just enough and like drips and blips that I knew there was a story there, but I didn't, that was it. It was like, I'd been like covered in like, somebody's alumni magazine or something, 500 word stories that all essentially told the same 2 or 3 anecdotes. So I was like, man, I need to, so I just wrote down the names of everybody that popped up in these little stories. And I got maybe 5 or 6 and I just started calling. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. Like I had so little information, but I was like, let me just start calling people. And one of the first people I came across was John Moon. And, I'm thankful for that because as luck would have it, John had been trying since 1975, since October of 1975 to get the world to pay attention to what had happened. And so when I called him, there was sort of like anything else, there was a bit of like a period where we were kind of feeling each other out, but he really, really quickly just began, sort of unspooling this story. And the more that I heard, the bigger it got and the more interested I got. And the more people who, that was the thing that blew me away. It was like each person who entered this story had something more fantastical in their past than the last person. And it was like, man, how can this be true? And it was just, it's just one of those incredible things, like uncovering that was really like so much fun.
So you got to sit down and have conversations with John Moon and talk about what he experienced.
Yeah. I had to, he had been, like I said, there had been like really short things written about him. And, when if somebody's interviewing you for a short piece, you got to kind of like give them your really quick soundbitey things that they can, that convey the message. And so I had to like talk to him a few times to get past all that because he was so used to giving those answers and sort of telling those particular anecdotes. And I just kept calling him back and we just kept talking and talking. And then he would say, you should call this person. So I would call that person. He said, you should call Phil Hallen. And, I called Phil Hallen and I talked to George McCary. I talked to Mitch Brown. I talked to Darnella, and I was sort of making very, very slow progress with Saffir's widow, his son. She's in her 90s and her sons were very protective of her and, were gatekeeping. They just weren't going to let any old buddy speak to her. But, I just kept at it and just kept poking and visiting archives. And luckily, the fight was very public in Pittsburgh at the time. So there were literally thousands of newspaper articles that were written between, 68 and 75 detailing this whole period. So I was able to just do a ton of research. And every time I'd find something, I would call John back up or I would call somebody else up and say, hey, what was this? But there was a clock ticking. There was a lawyer I tracked down who was there in the beginning who helped to create it. And in between when I found him and when we were scheduled to meet, he died, so there was definitely this sort of ticking clock of like, some of this living history is not going to be living for very long.
Right. That is so wild. How long did it take you to get the full story and write this all down?
Well, I did it in 3 phases. So I come across the story and I knew I had to fly around the country to do this. The publisher who put out American Strangers just didn't immediately see the siren story, which is funny. Like that editor has since emailed me to say like, hey man, I was wrong. Like every once in a while we're all wrong and I was wrong. But so I was like, okay, I'm doing this on my own. So I want someone to pay for these flights. So I pitched it as a magazine article, which is, by necessity shorter. they gave me the money to fly to Boston and to fly to Pittsburgh and to do some of the work that I needed to do. Like the first sort of bit of research came out in the spring of 2019. And then as soon as that article was released, 99% Invisible, the podcast, came out, and they were like, hey man, this is such a great story. Why don't we turn this into a podcast episode? So we sort of worked out what that would look like over the summer of 2019. And then we began doing that work in the spring, or excuse me, in the fall. So I spent a few months in the fall working on it. And then, 2020 comes and like sort of the world grinds to a halt. So I'd stopped working at that point. I'd written an article, I produced this podcast. I set it aside. There were many other things happening, obviously. And then in the summer of 2020, my agent called me one day. We were on vacation, and she was like, this is so stupid. Like, you're holding on, like you've got a third of what is one of the greatest stories I've ever heard uncovered. Like, why would you stop digging? Let's do this. Let's turn this thing into a book. And so we got home from vacation, and I wrote the proposal. It went out on a Friday morning, and by that afternoon, the proposal was bought by a publisher. It was just like one of those great moments. So then I researched. At that point, I was like, I'm not going to do any writing. I'm just going to spend the next year, because everything at that point had been really rushed. Like the magazine thing, I sold it, and then they immediately were like, hey, think you could publish this like 2 months earlier than we originally agreed on? So like everything had kind of been rushed a little bit. And then I was like, I just want to take some time with this and just dig into the story as deep as possible. So I spent all of the rest of 20 and then, a chunk of 21 just researching. And then I took about 6 months and just wrote the book. And it moved pretty quickly, to be honest with you, because there's just so much information and the story is just so incredible. It just sort of laid itself out, in a lot of ways.
Is there anything when you were researching that really stood out and spoke to you and kind of has stuck with you throughout that research journey and writing that book?
Oh yeah. I mean, so much of it I related to, just like the underdog nature of the guys at Freedom House. Like I'm an outsider. Like my parents did not go to college, like like, so I was not, growing up, I was not like, it's not like I was like, we weren't, like on the welfare line or something, but we weren't like on the nice part of it. You know what I mean? So I was like,
same.
kind of an outsider. And then, I go to college and come out as a reporter, but I didn't go to a big New York school. I didn't have a big magazine internship, to this day. Like I'm not one of those, you're never going to see my name in the New Yorker. Like I'm not. So I've always kind of been, on the outside. And then, so like that part of it, sort of the underdog, the outsider, like I just get like people trying to change their circumstances. Again, as like someone who grew up working class and knew like, I don't want to drive a fuel oil truck. And I don't want to, collate receipts in an office, which is what, my mother and stepfather did, or I don't want to climb telephone poles like my dad. Like I need to change my situation. I need to find a way to do something different. Like I knew what it means to want to escape. And then, I look at Saffer, his story, clearly a genius. I mean, nominated multiple times for the Nobel Prize in Medicine, invents numerous things that drastically change the quality of living and the ability to live and how lives are saved everywhere. Monumental inventions that this guy came up with. But he hits the US as like this little short guy with a super strong accent with a specialty that nobody's ever heard of. And he has this world-changing idea and he wants to challenge the medical establishment. And they basically tell him like, no, dude, people like you just don't do this, like we're right and you're wrong. And he just does it. Like he doesn't care. He just does it on his own. And those CPR studies are the ultimate example of someone just saying like, nope, I'm right. And I'm going to gamble on it. And I definitely like, I'm not Saffer's, I don't have his towering intellect, but I certainly know that feeling of like, you're not going to tell me no, like I'm not going to be stopped. And like the hell with that. I'm going to give this thing a shot and I'm going to do it. that whole part of the story has always really stuck with me because it's just such a great example of someone refusing to be told no, which honestly, that's really so much of what the book is about, is people refusing to
Absolutely.
conform to what other people believe of them.
Absolutely. And I think that I was so surprised by some of the old resuscitation techniques that I had never heard of.
Yeah.
I laughed at some of that. And then the fear that they must have had standing there with this, what would become a world renowned doctor, and him saying, okay, I'm going to take this patient's respiratory drive away and you're going to intubate them. Oh my gosh. And these are normal folks that have volunteered for a research project. How deafeningly scary is that? I mean, that would just be a silence that that is terrifying. But in reality, that's kind of what we do every day when we walk into a bad scene and that you expected to go to work. And I guess he prepared them so well for that. And I think that's why they excelled really the way that they did. You know, and the fact that he takes these normal guys, rides around the neighborhood and just picks up normal guys and says, you're going to be a paramedic, and just starts working on it. I mean, the whole book is just amazing. The whole story is amazing. But I guess the inner question I have for you as the author is like, so now, and I'm kind of seeing a progression in your writing. So 1,000 Naked Strangers was kind of your story. When did the turn happen that you were like, I'm going to find other heroes and write about them? Because the next book is also about a group of heroes that bring one of the first Ebola patients back to the United States in 2014. So kind of where did that turn happen where you said, I'm going to write about other people now? Like you told your story and now I'm going to talk about me, or now I'm going to talk about them rather.
I knew I had a story to tell with strangers, but I knew that I didn't have 16 of those, So the question really was like, well, what's the next subject going to be? Sirens, I didn't choose it so much as somebody suggested it. And I immediately saw its potential and was moved by it and was like, God, I don't care if somebody buys this thing or not. The first publisher said no. I was like, I've got to try to do this. The story's, absolutely incredible. But in the process of that, what I realized was, as much as I love all these other aspects of writing and I'm interested in so many different things, most people who write don't have like a real understanding of, like, not the science of medicine, but like the visceral reality of being with a patient who's dying, or the fear that you have the first time you step out and have to do this job or any kind of medical care, like just the anxiety that comes with all of that. And, the just all the emotions that get wrapped up in it. I mean, I understand that really well. And obviously we've all studied medicine. We've all done those things. Like, somebody says something to you, like the topic comes up and you're going to be able to speak intelligently about various aspects of it. So I've got that going on. But I think the main thing is like the psychology of a provider is just something that I can understand. And so when someone begins to tell me, I'm not a physician. I'm not an ID specialist. I have not practiced medicine in Monrovia in the midst of, the world's largest and deadliest Ebola outbreak. I do not know what those things are like. But when I'm talking to Linda Mabula and she's describing what it felt like to be a 30-year-old physician, totally out of her element, in an incredibly dangerous situation, trying to save someone who she was pretty convinced was going to die and who she was really attached to as a patient because they were so similar to her. My experience put me into her shoes really quickly and, was allowed me to ask, sort of the right questions. The same thing when I was researching Sirens, John would say, yeah, so my first day, and I knew the questions to ask. I mean, if somebody talked to you about their first day as a paramedic, you would know those questions to ask. Like, first day someone steps on an ambulance, like, what's going through their mind. You would know how to elicit the right stories out of them. And so I was able to say, well, hold on, man, like you had to be scared. Like, and of course he'd start laughing and he'd be like, of course I was scared, and then the story, like, you need to know those things. And so it was the process of Sirens that made me realize, like, whatever it is I do, I think for a little while, I want to stay in that particular world, the world, like some form of emergency or disaster medicine, because I'm not only fascinated by it, but I do get it, and I really enjoy being involved in it. And so when No One's Coming came up, it so many things that I love about, like, a rescue and, the sort of international intrigue and, like, what little kid didn't grow up loving jets and,
Mhm.
the State Department's involved and the President of the United States is involved. And, there are countries in Africa that are falling because of this crazy virus. And, like we all have seen Contagion and we've seen 28
Yeah.
Days Later, like
Yeah.
you talk about to people who are in the midst of an Ebola crisis, like they will tell you like, yeah, man, it felt like the zombie apocalypse. And, it was like, had so many incredible elements.
And it really never affected us here like it did them. And I don't guess I knew as a young man that this was really going on to the extent that it was. And so your book not only entertained me, but it also educated me a little bit about what was happening. The same way that Sirens did. It was an education lesson for me too, while it was still entertaining. So you've written these 3 books now. What are you doing next? I mean, like, what's the clip of something you can give us that you're doing next, or are you just generally writing? I met a writer not long ago that said, "I just write. And if it becomes a book, it does." And I was like, "That's wild."
No, I don't yet have it. I mean, I'm just like, No One's Coming has just come out, and I've spent
Right.
the last couple years in Ebola and infectious disease and like this crazy company, like these wild ass cowboy, pilots and doctors who fly around the world doing things that nobody wants to do. Like their story, the madness of this story, just how crazy it was. The fact that like the state of Maine wanted to press felony charges against a government official for helping to rescue these Americans who were stranded like who were dying overseas. Like that story has consumed me for so long now because it was like so riveting, so much fun. So like I just couldn't turn away from it. But I loved it's a rescue in a way that none of these other things have been a rescue.
Mhm.
You know, getting like the fact that that this technology was developed to fit inside of an aircraft, a very small aircraft, and like how they did that and how like this very Apollo 11 kind of technical genius that went into creating the system. All of those things like have kind of like I enjoyed that so much that I'm like, all right, so what else is out in that particular world? In the same way that I write Sirens and go, okay, like what else is out in the medical world? I'm kind of looking at this now saying, okay, what else is out there in terms of like this sort of rescue that, cause I mean, this book is like, when I first was talking to people about it, I was like, from a movie standpoint, it's like, it's Outbreak meets Argo. In terms of books, it's The Perfect Storm meets The Hot Zone. It's like, it has all of those elements all wrapped into one. It's a rescue, but it's also this contagion that's killing thousands and thousands of people. So being in that world, that like high stakes international rescue, like part of me is like, well, what else is here? Because this has been really fun
Yeah.
to get into. I mean, it's a crazy, crazy story.
Well, I think and you hit on it a little bit. When I opened it up, or when I opened up the file for it, because I listened to it on audiobook, but it was very interesting to me the first couple chapters because I'm thinking, okay, this is kind of medical, but I'm getting more characters here than I had gotten previously, I felt like, or different walks of life, I should say.
Mm, mhm.
Especially when you get into the Phoenix Air story and you talk about some of the maintenance guys, you talk about the engineers, and you talk about everybody that went into. There's just so many personalities in that book. And at first I was like, well, other than the Ebola, where's the medical side of this? And then you kind of get into some of the latter chapters and talk about exactly what it was like walking into some of that isolation. Did you ever get to have a mock-up, or was this just all mental image of what this could look like? Or was this eyewitness testimony of what this particular situation looked like back in 2014?
I've been in the Aero Medical Biocontainment Unit. It is tiny. Like the fact that they were inside of an aircraft that was rocketing across the Atlantic, treating patients who had the scariest and one of the most contagious diseases known to man. It was mind blowing. I mean, you can't stand up straight. It's just over 5 feet tall. And I'm 6'2". Like I had to really crouch. And within minutes, like your back starts to hurt, your legs start to shake. Like I don't know how they did that in full PPE the whole time, being scared that they were going to get Ebola. I mean, that, like, how you do that, I just, like, it's superhuman. I mean, it's only like 3+ feet wide. It's like 8 feet long, but you got to put in the stretcher. You put in a patient whose bodily fluids are coming out all over the place, all the blood and all that sweat and everything else. You want to avoid that. Your equipment is in there. So it's such a tiny, confined space. And it's so incredibly hot. So to just stand there for a minute, talk, which immediately, like, the next thing is like, you call the doctor back up, you're like, or the nurse back up, and you say, hey man, you're as tall as I am. I was just in there for 2 minutes and you had to spend 40 minutes in there at a time, multiple times on this, intercontinental flight in PPE, worried that you were going to catch a virus. Like, what was that like? I mean, how tired were you? How scared were you that you were going to trip or just like collapse, which almost happened? And, they'd be like, oh dude, we were so scared, like it was,
Gosh.
not only scared for ourselves, but if they had made a mistake, what starts out as 2 patients being brought to the United States becomes an Ebola outbreak in North America. I mean, they brought Ebola to the US for the first time. The very first Ebola patients ever treated in the United States were brought over in this aircraft, in this like crazy piece of technology that these guys made. And so then, the next question is like, why? Like, are you crazy? And then, the answer is like a little bit of yeah. I mean, the
Yeah.
things that they say yes to, things they do. I mean, transporting, Gaddafi's suitcase nuke, out of Libya, and all the like flying explosives all around the world, and that whole story about them flying warheads for the during the Gulf War, and delivering things in the middle of wars, or getting hostages out of incredibly hostile situations. People have been like brutalized and badly injured, pulling people out of North Korea, like all these crazy things that they have been involved with. And then you meet them and they're, they kind of live up to expectations.
Really?
I mean, they're sort of exactly what you expect. They're just this like wild ass bunch of cowboys who are really, really good at what they do and have become known around the world for basically saying yes when everybody else in good sense would tell you to say no.
Yeah, there's even that portion that really, really solidified to me that these guys are either really passionate or they're just nuts. They're in the air and they don't know if they're gonna be allowed to land.
Yeah.
And in your writing of it, it just seems like they're like, "Well, they'll figure it out. We're okay." And it had to be so I would have been so stressed. And not to
Yeah.
mention all the physical part of bending over and taking care of a patient in isolation, but, there was just an unreal calm that seemed to radiate through the book with these guys.
Yeah. I mean, because I think they knew, like that first patient who came in, they were somewhat aware that there were a lot of people who did not want this patient to be brought to the US. There was all these protests, there were bomb threats. The FBI had to follow the ambulance through Atlanta. So they were familiar that they were aware that this is a bad situation and that people really did not want this to come in. I don't think they expected to come into the US and find out that they had nowhere to land, that not a single airstrip on the eastern seaboard would say yes. And so, Dent Thompson, one of the two brothers who runs Phoenix Air, did a good job of just like not letting them know. But, I think that's their their calm all the way through is a product of them doing this job for as long as they have. I mean, that's kind of why I wanted to set it up with these stories of these crazy situations that they flew into through the years, and plane crashes in exotic locales and all these different wild things that they had been through. And then, how calm the pilots were in dealing with this thing, how calm the doctors become in dealing with all these, like
Yeah.
really difficult situations. so that when they get to this moment and the entire world is watching them and half the world is trying to stop them and the other half the world is sort of holding their breath saying, we really don't think you guys can pull this off, and them still pulling off this rescue against all odds, like, it's not stupidity, it isn't arrogance, it's the right personality signing up for the right job and having the right experience and the right equipment. Even though they, I mean, like, they didn't have PPE, as you're aware, like they had to go to Home Depot because they didn't have enough. And so, they're walking into,
Yeah.
the deadliest Ebola outbreak in human history with PPE that they bought at Home Depot. Like, it is wild, but it isn't half cocked. It's, like, those are the workings of people who have really, put in the hours and like have confidence and faith in each other, and in their own abilities.
What an awesome story. So, in your EMS career, obviously, we see in your first book that there was some, at least to some extent, some mental distress that brought you. Do you feel like writing brings a different sense of mental distress,
Oh
or is it
God.
more of a release for you?
I mean, like, there are occasions where it feels like a release. No, the vast majority of it, but, like, unfortunately, I'm a deadline driven person. So if you
Yeah.
tell me you need something at noon on Thursday, you will get it at noon on Thursday. Which means that at 11:59, I'm going to be like,
Yeah.
so I kind of need that stress to go. I do very well when when I have sort of, when something's clipping at my heels and I wake up and I do what I have to do and I keep going. But if I have 6 hours to do 2 hours worth of work, I mean, will I get that 2 hours worth of work done? I don't know. I mean, I really have to whip myself to make it happen. Like, that's just sort of how I'm wired. It's like, when do you need it? Okay, that's when you have it. But that creates so much stress. When I was writing Sirens, I told you, like, I spent all this time, I was like, I just want
Mhm.
to research. I don't want to start writing. I just want to, like, just put all my research in order and do all this research. I woke up on New Year's Day and I was like, I have written not one word of this book and it's due on August 1st. And I have thousands of pages of documents and thousands of newspaper articles that, like, I will never forget that feeling of panic of, like, oh my God, I've only got a few months and I still, like, there was more information I wanted to gather. There's certainly more information I wanted to organize. And I had written a single word and I had to, like, begin and finish that book, in under 8 months, because at some point you got to read back through and edit the thing, so I was like, oh my
Mhm.
God, how am I going to get this done? And that feeling of panic, I mean, I had that every day when I sat down to write. It was like, I got to get some, because suddenly it's June and you're like, I'm only halfway there. Like, we got to move. Yeah. No,
Wow.
not always a calming experience.
Well, you do a great job. You've given me some fantastic answers and comments, and definitely clip worthy for sure. If you had a message to send to active working first responders right now that live in our world, what is that message from you?
The thing that I've taken away from these books that I've written about other people is that, there's so much divisiveness. And, I think there's a lot of, we live in this weird sort of very selfish time where everybody's always like, well, what's have to do with me? Or I'm not, it doesn't affect me if it doesn't affect me. And talking to people, whether it was in Pittsburgh in the 1960s or in, Congo in 2014, or, here in Atlanta in 2014, what I came across over and over again was this, like, selflessness, this willingness to put themselves at risk for other people they did not know, uh, because they felt it was the right thing. That comment from Jonathan Jackson, the nurse who was on the first flight, who was an incredibly experienced nurse, and, he was like, when I saw them coming over to me right before they told me we were going to be doing these Ebola transports, if you'd asked me what I was, I'd have said, we're some badass nurses who can do anything. And the moment they crossed the street and told me we were about to transport Ebola patients, my first thought was, I need to go home and talk to my wife. And, but like, he had to reckon with, like, I've said I'm willing to do this. Am I actually willing to do this?
Yeah.
And the answer for him was yes. And for all these people, it's always yes. And I think if you were to poll the people on an ambulance right now, like, the answer would be yes. Like, that is the nature of the job. Like, nobody's going to do anything stupid to get themselves injured, but it is an inherently dangerous job. And you are doing what you're doing for people who will never know your name, whose name you really won't know, and certainly who you will never come to understand in any real way. These are strangers, and yet you're doing this for them, not out of a sense of obligation, but just out of a sense of service. Like the willingness to step forward and treat other people with the care and respect that we do when we're delivering medical care. I mean, it's such an intimate act, you and me talking about that old lady, you're in her house. Like, there's nothing more like personal than just you and some old woman in her kitchen having this conversation, like, forget the sirens and the blood and the madness. Like, that is so much of what the job is. And, that, like, it takes a lot to do this, and it takes a certain kind of person, but what that kind of person is someone who has an eagerness to serve, someone who is driven, who's called to serve. There's always talked about with soldiers, understandably, but it's not talked about so much in this field. And I think very similarly, people feel called to serve. And I mean, that's what it is. And so much of the time you are putting yourself on the line for a stranger simply because you know it's the right thing to do. And you're someone who's willing to step forward and do it. And so, like, while the rest of us are sitting here screaming, going like, are there no heroes? Like, what are people willing to risk? What's the cause we're willing to risk ourselves for? Like, anyone in that uniform right now on an ambulance, they already know the answer to that question. So
Exactly
hats
right.
off to them.
Exactly right. Well, Kevin, thank you for agreeing to be on our show. Thank you for giving me such great stuff. Like I said, this podcast has allowed me to live a little bit of my dream. I have got to interview people that I've idolized. You're definitely one of them, one of my favorite authors by far. And really, the A Thousand Naked Strangers a couple years ago reignited my love for reading. So I appreciate that from you. I appreciate everything you give us. And you've definitely, in my opinion, etched your name in history a little bit because you've given us these great stories. And so I really do. I thank you. I really appreciate what you do.
Well, Kevin, thank you, man. I can't, I can't thank you enough. Like, that means a lot. It really does. Like, when I wrote the books, I didn't write it specifically, any of them, for the EMS community, but I wanted people who've done the job to say, yeah, that's what it's like. And so, like, to have someone say, yeah, man, you got it right. Like, that means the world. It really does.
You did. You got it right. Well, Kevin, I do appreciate you joining us. And guys, if you're listening to us, you can find us in all the places, all the social media. Where can we find you at, Kevin?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram, which I guess means automatically I'm on Facebook. Find me in those two places. And, the new book, No One's Coming, is out anywhere that you get books.
Awesome read. You can purchase any of his books in numerous places. I'll link some links in the show bio for you guys so that you're able to go right to it. Love everything you're doing. Hope for another one in a year or two, when you've had time to research again and find another awesome story to tell us. But guys, you can always reach out to us. We offer trained peer support for you guys that if you need it, we're here for you. That's one of our favorite parts of the job. We have a team of great people that work behind me. I just am fortunate and blessed enough to get to be the voice and producer of all of this and creator. So I'm so excited for what the future has to hold. Again, Kevin, you've let me live a little bit of my dream. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, appreciate it, Kev. Thanks so much.
Yep. And as we say every week, everybody be safe, take care of your mind, and we'll talk soon.
You've been listening to A Silent War Within. If this episode resonated, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, you're not alone and your well-being matters. It's time to end this silent war.